Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today bringing a tournament recap for a tournament that happened quite a while ago, all the way back at the beginning of October, and I guess maybe it went through November, I'm not really sure, but basically a lot of months ago. And I just didn't get around to covering it, and obviously haven't posted a video in quite a while either. But yeah, so this was the 6th Kaijudo Open, and the results here: first place Raijinku, second place Darksigner, third place me. So congrats to Raijinku for a win. This was 6-player round robin, so just a small little tournament. Raijinku ended up winning the tiebreaker match because they both finished 4-1 after the round robin stage. They played one more match after that just to see who would win, and Raijinku ended up winning that one as well. So overall finished with a 5-1 record. Here are kind of the breakdown as well of the final standings. So myself 3-2, Louis 2-3, Andros 1-4, Claude 1-4 as well. So I guess I'll cover the decks in just a few, but Claude played Light Water Dark Panopter, Andros played Light Water Dark Tempo, Louis played Water Dark Aggro, I played Water Nature Aggro, the same deck from the previous tournament that I profiled. Pretty lazy on that front. Darksigner played an interesting Fire Dark Rush deck, which we will get to, and Raijinku played an interesting Light Water Dark Shield Blast control deck, basically. So yeah, that's kind of the brief overview of the final standing. So congrats to Raijinku for winning his first, I think, Kaijudo Open so far. Yeah, I think that means of all the entrants this time, the only ones without a tournament win so far are Louis and Claude, but maybe they'll get their time in the future. But yeah, let's just jump into the decks. So the first deck we have is Claude's Light Water Dark Panopter. I believe just an update to the version he brought last time. This time, I think he's trying Mark of Eternal Haven is a new one. Renegade Hero Finbar as well. So, I mean, overall, I still don't really like the Panopter stuff. I think it's just pretty weak against most things, just pretty underwhelming. Just weak to a lot of, like, Piercings, Finbars, Lyras, really weak to Dragons, really weak to... Against other controls, it's just your deck is pretty clunky. Like, blockers, at the end of the day, are just really inflexible, underwhelming cards, in my opinion. And I don't know, when it's like small stuff like Reef Scout, which just gets kind of run over quick easily, it's just a speed bump. Like, you're trying to be good against aggro, but at the same time your deck's just a little too underwhelming. And like against mid-range and control, your just deck's not that consistent. And like, you have the discard stuff, so if you can get discard into Panopter and then kind of go through, but at the same time the ultimate problem is your deck's just not very threatening. Like, you're trying to draw till you find like Haven, and then you can hopefully drop it a little later, which is part of the solution I think Claude's going for, is just to speed up that ability to turn the corner. Because obviously one of the other things is there's no Sky Shark in here, so his ability to just kind of build a board quickly, present a big threat, and even then, even if you have Sky Shark, the problem that it just gets removed and everything else can't attack, it just makes it pretty fragile. And I think, I don't know, like the approach of just good stuff like Water Dark is fine. I mean, Lurking Skullcutter is okay as a card. Like, there's a lot of just good stuff. I just felt like the deck is still kind of underwhelming in this form. But I mean, maybe that's like an inescapable truth of Panopter in general. One of the things I was talking to Claude with after the tournament, I always like the idea of Aggrix in these decks. Like, Ground Manipulator is pretty cool for just being able to, like, if your Panopter gets killed, you can just revive it alongside a 1-drop even. And that just gives you a way to like draw a card, build a board. Aggrix also is a quick way to win a game when you've taken over with Panopter. Like, you can just really quickly just, again, build a board, and then Aggrix takes advantage of all those bodies, letting you just kind of alpha strike, attack with everything. It kind of gives you like a Sky Shark without needing to play Sky Shark in that spot, but you can also still play Sky Shark with your Aggrix, and that can be pretty cool as well. So I really like Aggrix, and then Serpens, maybe you just lower the curve and go that direction, because Serpens obviously can play pretty nice with a bunch of blockers as well. So I kind of like going that route, but maybe it's still a little underwhelming. Haven obviously helps for certain things, and it's a pretty big threat, but you just don't consistently find it that much. And Mark makes it a little more threatening, but it's also just a really terrible standalone card. So yeah, I don't know. It's overall, I mean, I think Claude ended up performing 1-4, so didn't do too hot. I think the one deck he beat was Raijinku's Light Water Dark Shield Blast control deck, which basically has almost no game. I think, spoiler alert, he played like the Veilslip Blackfeather stuff, which could be good, but the problem is his deck just didn't have a lot of good Veilslip Blackfeather hits. And the problem is, if Claude Claude could get a Haven in play, then his Veilslip Blackfeather is almost irrelevant anyways. So yeah, it was in a spot where that matchup was just really easy for Claude because like Reginku just couldn't really do anything about Panopter, and then you actually get a Live the Dream where you just build up your board and drop Haven whenever you find it, and yeah, you don't have to worry too much about that. So yeah, he beat the one matchup that was really soft to his deck, and then unfortunately I think he played a bunch of somewhat tight matches against some of the other aggro decks in the field, beating all the other one, or he lost to all the other aggro decks unfortunately. But so maybe that's kind of a flaw with this deck. Like you think a blocker deck would maybe be good against aggro, but unfortunately it's just usually too clunky. Like just the format of cards, maybe you would play cheaper stuff instead. Like it's just a little bit slow, but I don't know. Maybe there's a way to figure it out, but didn't end up doing too well this time. All right, so the next deck we have is Andros bringing Lightwater Dark Tempo. So this, obviously, most of these tempo lists, like there's just a ton of cards you can play in this deck, and it's just about mixing and matching the cards and figuring out what kind of stuff you want. So obviously, like he's got a bunch of the open stuff with Lyra's, Screeching Scared Orbles. No Boneblades in this list, no Psychic Predators, but 3 regular Aqua Chasers, went for 2 Mesmerize. So yeah, just a bit of everything. I guess one thing to say, this is a deck that honestly, like overall with Lightwater Dark Tempo, the more I've played with it, like I've always considered it one of the better decks in the game and just have it on there based on its reputation. But the more I've played with it myself, the more underwhelming it feels to me. Like I think it's pretty good against like a lot of these like random Haven piles. Like but that's because like like the core of like Scamp, Laws, Finbar, Cephal, like all that stuff, it just kind of runs over those Haven controls a lot of the time. Like I feel like you have decent matchups there, and then you're pretty good against like some of the linear aggressive stuff like Rush usually, but maybe this build without Gloom Hollows, Boneblades, it's a little worse. But usually you're kind of good against those like aggro matchups with this kind of deck. But then the more I've played, I feel like the evolution-based aggro decks are just a lot tougher usually, and so I don't know, it just feels, maybe the problem is like you have to get the right mix of cards, and it's really hard to do that because there's so many options. It's a tough deck to build, especially like for any given metagame. Like if you actually like have some prediction, it's kind of tough to get the mix right. So maybe that's a problem with my own builds, but then at the same time, I usually just play kind of the stock lists from tournament results back in the day, and even those just like I don't do too much of my own tinkering, and even those I just feel a little bit underwhelmed by. But maybe it's a deck that you have to be really knowledgeable and good at playing, and I'm probably not a good enough player because a lot of the people that had a lot of great tournament success with this deck were some of the better players in the game. So I feel like it's one of those decks that rewards really knowing what you're doing. But at the same time, I don't know, like I just find it a little bit underwhelming these days. But I mean, and maybe Andros does too, because I mean he didn't have too great a performance. I think he beat Claude and then lost to everyone else, which not a great showing. Like obviously against Claude's deck, piercing Finbar, Blinder Beetle Prime, kind of wreck house. I'm not sure, maybe the mix of cards in this deck wasn't right. Like, but that's probably one of the problems with this deck. Like usually it's a little clunky. You have a bunch of multi-civs. Usually the curve is pretty bad. Like you have Finbar's Lyras, you have Regent Sasha, Blinder Beetle Prime, and then you have all these expensive stuff like Terror Pit and Arbiter, so you want to play like Boneblades for a cheaper card, but then even Boneblades is just this kind of reactive, kind of proactive tool at times, but also reactive card, and I don't know, it's just all over the place. Like it's hard to get the mix right, like I said, and then usually it's just got a little bit too clunky of a curve. Like one of the big problems I have is like you only have like Scamp and Strider, and like one of those is really good against the control matchups, and one of those is really good against the aggro matchups, but you also just don't draw, like you just like you're hinging on that 1-2 drop in either matchup, and like you're just not that consistently going to draw that, right? So I think like maybe you just need to play more 2 drops and then just be a little bit lower to the ground. But I don't know, it's just hard to get, like I said, it's hard to get the mix right. It usually feels like it's just a little too clunky and slow, but then that's part of why you play such good Shield Blast, is to try to make up for that. But I don't know, it's hard to say. Maybe it just needs updates to the kind of list that we're building, but yeah, unfortunate performance. Maybe would have thought you'd do better with this kind of deck, but I don't know, kind of tough tournament run there for Andros. But overall, like I said, it's a deck that I've kind of been more and more underwhelmed by as I've played with it lately, but I don't know, maybe that's just me and my style of just kind of more linear, proactive stuff. But yeah, regardless, moving on to the next deck. All right, so next we have Louis' Water Dark Aggro deck. So I think this is kind of a follow-up to the list he played in the last tournament, which was a Water Fire Glurgle deck. Obviously, he moved away from all the Glurgle nonsense and some of the cards that, like the Rusalka, Queen Rusalka, I think, that didn't really function very well, and decided to add a bit of darkness stuff, which I guess the Slayers are pretty cool in working with Hovercraft, and then you have some decent Shield Blasts. Um, I don't know if you really need to pair Dark with it, but I think the main thing he was going for was just Hovercraft Glurgle seemed really interesting alongside like the Cyber Sprites to just block and protect your board, and then Emperor Neuron protecting that and just able to go that direction. I think honestly I would almost like to just see like Aqua Initiates as well, because I think like truly like just protecting your stuff with these cheap 1 mana blockers where you have a Hovercraft out is really good. Um, so yeah, maybe I just feel like the darkness is not super necessary. Like you have Underworld Stalker to pair with Cyber Trader, which is pretty cool, but then Underworld Stalker on its own is quite a slow card for this kind of deck. There's obviously a pretty heavy Evo count. Maybe like you could mix it up a little bit more. Maybe Dendrite can be pretty nice. Calortha is good in certain spots, but I always like Dendrite. Maybe Ice Belly, Blowfish. It didn't strike me as super powerful. I didn't play a ton with this deck. Usually I play a lot more with all the decks for tournaments, but I didn't do that as much of that this time around. But yeah, I think Ice Belly was decent. I think, yeah, maybe you could just go more of a straight up mono water approach. Maybe splash like a few Shield Blasts, but maybe pick a different. Maybe you decide to splash like Storm Sparks and Arbiters instead, or maybe you just keep the darkness ones if you want to. I don't know. Like I could see, or just go full on mono water for this kind of approach. But yeah, I think overall these kinds of decks I'm not a super big fan of. Like I feel like Neuron is like the really key focus, but at the same time, like it's a card that's mostly good on the play, and it's a lot weaker on the draw, and at the same time, like it's weak to certain things as well, like certain key cards. And I don't know, like maybe Finbar as well is a little too expensive. I mean, it's Finbar, so maybe not, but yeah, I feel like this deck was maybe a little on the clunky side. Obviously, it's 41 cards as well. Maybe you could just cut like a Stalker, or maybe not, because you want to have the mana consistency, so maybe you cut like one of these other evolutions, trim a Blowfish or something. But yeah, I think maybe you want to like focus on the curve a little more, have a few more, even a little more 2-drops maybe, or maybe play those Aqua Initiates. So yeah, maybe if I like Hovercraft is also just, it's not the best, right? It's also weak to a lot of things, makes your boards like kind of secure in one sense, but also fragile in another. Because obviously, like if you just make some aggressive attacks and then they find some other way to remove Hovercraft, then you kind of get blown out. But I don't know. It's like it's good, but you're also just like planning to just rebuy your Neuron and play it and spend that every turn, which sometimes not so great. I don't know. I would maybe focus a little bit more on just maybe dropping the darkness and going a little more mono water, go wide kind of stuff. Maybe try some different evolutions out, but I don't know. Overall the deck kind of felt fine. Obviously it performed pretty well. I mean, he had a 2-3 performance, which wasn't bad. Ended up beating a couple of matches there. So yeah, decent deck. But yeah, moving on. All right, so the next deck I went 3-2 with Water Nature Aggro. So the same exact list again. I just didn't put any time into really preparation this time around. I just ran back the same list that I had won the last tournament with. I ended up going 3-2, which is fine. I lost to Darksigner and Raijinku. I think the Darksigner matchup, I think he had a slight edge in that one, especially with the draws he had. He had the kind of good draws that I don't have a chance with. I think, yeah, like his deck, pretty good against mine. Not all the time. Like I have certain draws. I think I remember making a kind of mistake with one of my mana decisions that I could have maybe made a better play, but yeah, it's tough. Like the deck is pretty good. It has some weaknesses. Definitely kind of low defenses can be exploited a bit, especially when people like learn how to play against the deck, where like trading into this deck is really bad usually. Like you want to just be kind of trying to race them, because like this deck it generates so much advantage that if you try to play this interactive slow game, even though this deck doesn't have the most in the way of interactive cards, like you can usually you'll just kind of lose these battles. Like Blinder Beetle Prime trying to like manage my board means like I'll usually just have the Evo to answer the Prime, and then you're kind of left without cards, and then I can just build up a big board and then win the game. So you're forced to almost like use your Prime more aggressively just to put on damage, and then use your Shield Blaster's reach to finish the game afterwards. That's usually the game plan that like other aggressive decks have to use against this. So when you kind of figure out that, it becomes easier to play against. So same thing is true with like cards like Taksha, Torhelm, or to some extent. But yeah, so this kind of deck is, yeah, it's been fine for me. Like it's pretty solid, just good against most things. Never too bad. Like even though it doesn't have that many shield blasts, I still haven't thought of any crazy ways to change the list. Like I think the 2-drops, like maybe you just move to some more robust cards, like cards with more power could be good. Maybe you eventually just go to Bronze Arm Renegade, even though it's a multi-save. Maybe you try Cyber Scamp. I don't know. Like you could change up some stuff, but overall it's still been performing pretty well for me, this list. All right, getting into the last couple lists here, we have Fire Dark Taksha Rush from Darksigner. So this has been his creation that he's been working on for a while. I remember, I think we had like a couple sessions where we played and polished it up, and this was kind of the final product. Just the main thing is like just 15 1-drops, just basically all of them except the puppet thing, Forsaken Puppet, because obviously it's not really a good bait for Taksha because it enters tap. But yeah, basically just all the 1-drops, and you just swarm and drop like early Torhelms and Takshas. If you don't see either of these cards, this deck is going to look like absolute garbage. If you just see Torhelm or multiple Torhelms, like multiple Torhelms is pretty good against most matchups. Sometimes not so much, but yeah, multiple Torhelms is good. If you just see a Torhelm, you're going to be in a bad way. If you just see a Taksha, you're going to be pretty fine. But if you don't see any Taksha, like it can be rough. It can be rough. Your deck's going to look pretty bad, but usually you see the cards decent enough with some of the other filtering going on. But yeah, basically some of the cool stuff about this deck, I mean, there's a lot of hands you might want to take the draw. Think about doing that, because you can go like one of the ideal curves. Obviously, it's like 1-drop into 2-drop into 1-drop evolve into Taksha on both of your 1-drops, and that kind of curve. If you want to also get the discard and draw 2 cards, you want to be going second, unless I guess you expect your opponent to attack you, like they have a 1-drop or something like a Magris that attacks you on their second turn. But yeah, this deck is pretty good overall, I would say. Like if you draw the Takshas and stuff, like you're very good at managing boards with Taksha and Torhelm in the early game. Like you just dominate the board early. Just Taksha generates a bunch of cards that you can use for generate reach. Like it usually chains into another evolution or your Wildfire Valkyries, and you can go wide pretty nicely as well. So it just ends up being a really powerful deck, just manages the board well. Great against dragons, because Torhelm and Taksha both are very, very strong cards against the dragon deck. Hard to deal with, do a good job protecting themselves from Herald, and also like pick off your birds, which is just very strong. They're also like card like Torhelm is very resilient to certain shield blasts, like piercing, especially Arbiter, stuff like that. So it's just a very strong deck in that regard. You generate advantage. You're obviously weak to certain stuff too, like Bone Blades is very good against Taksha. So yeah, that can be a weakness of the deck. You have Time Lost Phantom just for a little bit of extra draw power, kind of, right? It just does a good job doing that stuff. Underworld Stalker is a little slow, obviously. It gives you something to discard for value, which you have a lot of cards. You might as well just play something like that. It also functions nicely as a mana sink, especially against nature decks where they have Root Traps and Tentacle Grasp, because it actually comes up a lot in those matchups. Because if you do get your Taksha Tentacle Grasp, you just have so much mana to play with. And it comes up a lot that Underworld Stalker just being that mana sink is pretty nice, just to get an extra body out there. Helps in other certain matchups, like grindier matchups. Maybe still on the slow side, but it's been performing pretty well. And you, at the end of the day, you do need a decent dark count. So it's just an extra good card to play. The last 4 slots here are probably the most, like everything else in this deck has felt like pretty necessary. It's just the last 4 slots that are tinkered with. Obviously, Darksigner with the call out to Claude with the Blaze Helix pick. Just when you have all this filtering and stuff, you might as well throw something in there like that. I don't think it came up for him at all. I think he mentioned it was probably not worth playing either way, but maybe it could be a dark card instead. Sinister Scheme also, I mean, I think before the tournament I was mentioning to Darksigner that I didn't love having no Shield Blast, because the initial build was playing like 3 Mesmerize. And yeah, no Shield Blast is kind of rough, because it's just really easy to play, like just to set up your kind of 2-turn lethals. So having a card like Sinister Scheme or Terra Pit or anything like that, any kind of Shield Blast, it just means like they can't set up for those guaranteed pushes, or there's a lot of times where they have to go for these 2-turn pushes. And if you don't play any Shield Blast, you'll just never win any of those games. If you play a playset of Sinister Schemes, all of a sudden, all of those games that are just super narrow and one on whether or not you have a shield blast, you win 30% of those, right? So you play a lot of those tight games where they're scrappy, you're going back and forth, you're racing. Like if you don't play any shield blast, you're just losing 30% more games than you have to, really. So in the of those tight ones. So I think you get a lot of mileage out of just having some amount of shield blast. Maybe Sinister Scheme wasn't. It was the fancy pick, right? Like obviously, if you're in those racing situations, they don't have the opportunity to out Taksha, then Sinister Scheme can potentially be a card that outs 2 cards, being able to discard. So that's kind of interesting, but it could just be Terra Pit or Bone Blades, or the other big card is Mesmerize. Just playing Mesmerize just solidifies the Dragon matchup a lot, because Mesmerize plus all this early pressure and board control just demolishes dragons. It just makes the matchup very, very, very difficult to lose. At least against, talking about like the more standard Oath Dragons lists that have been doing well in our tournaments. Obviously, if it's like a darkness-based control-y dragon list, it completely changes the whole dynamic. But yeah, against those Oath Dragon decks, I mean, being able to Mesmerize, they function a lot like a combo deck, right? Like a lot of it is winning with Oathsworn Call, and then they need to drop that Herald. And then they need to probably pair like a Twin Cannon Maelstrom with that Herald to get over your Taksha or your Torhelm. And just mesmerizing one of those pieces is just, you just can't lose very often. So a lot of the game becomes more about dropping Lyras and trying to shift the board enough to just be able to cheese a win. And that's where, again, those Shield Blasts can kind of come in if you do play both of those cards, which maybe you play like Mesmerize over some number of like Underworld Stalkers, for example. But yeah, you mix it around, because in those games, like when they're trying to set up Lyra and then kind of flip the corner and try to do that, because it's hard to stabilize when they're just chaining evolutions and Valkyries and stuff like that. You don't have blockers to protect from that reach. So like those Shield Blasts, that's when those come again and win you those percentage of games. So I don't know, but overall the deck has been pretty good. You could debate a lot of different stuff for the last few slots. Heliflame's another option too, just another card, so you're not super cold to Infernus. Like if someone drops an Infernus against you, at least have an out to potentially push for a little bit more damage. But yeah, that is the deck. Been performing pretty well. Like I said, it's going to look really good when you draw your evolutions. If you don't see them, your deck is going to look like garbage, but it's pretty consistent overall though, so despite all that. And yeah, Dark Center had a pretty good tournament. I mean, beat everyone except Raijinku in those couple matches. That matchup against me was somewhat close. I think, it wasn't that close. I think the 2 games he was like going first, he kind of wrecked me. He had the good like early Torhelm, like Valkyrie stuff. Yeah, just walked over me. The one game I won was just like, I was super on the back foot, but had like a late Artichoke and was able to like protect it with Broodmother, and it was like this like really scrappy win that I managed to pull out with like some weird sequences of draws from both of us, basically. But yeah, he kind of walked over me in that matchup, to be honest. But yeah, we'll get on to the final deck. All right, so this here is the final deck of the tournament. This is Raijinku's winning Shield Blast control deck. I think he called maybe it Aegis Control at one point, or Security Control relating to Digimon. I'm not exactly sure what he wanted to go with, but this is, 50 card, 4 card kind of pile, but not really a pile control deck at all. It's basically just a lot of Shield Blasts and stuff relating to shields, basically. So yeah, I think the idea, I mean, pretty much everyone has this thought of like, how do you approach building like just a pile of Shield Blasts? And there are some decks like it, even like Fresh Av is a lot of Shield Blasts, but it's not quite to this extent. And yeah, so it's a kind of interesting thought experiment. And obviously Raijinku wanted to try to figure something out. Obviously, kind of by nature, it's going to be a pretty exploitable strategy, right? Like you're just not going to be able to do that much playing your own game if your opponent's not attacking your shields. So if their deck can facilitate certain game plans that abuse that, then the matchups are going to be really hard. And I think that ties into like one of the key things about playing this deck is you need to identify like whether your Shield Blasts are kind of enough to stabilize and win you the game on their own base with maybe like a little bit of extra help. And that's going to be the case against a lot of like smaller, lower to the ground, like linear aggro decks that aren't as robust, maybe don't have as much card draw, or maybe even like or if they're like on the slower side of things where they're a little too clunky, then in those cases, like if they try to go in too early, like maybe the Shield Blast would be enough because they don't have that enough like sustained pressure. And then if they wait too long and you happen to draw into your like Blackfeather or like Veilslip Blackfeather and then have good mills, then you can kind of win the game that way. So they give you, their clunkiness buys you a bit of time and also makes it hard for them to put on like good sustained pressure early if they want to go that route. It makes it hard for them to exploit things because they're not consistently drawing a lot. So if they're like a clunky aggro deck, or if they're like just like a kind of weak low to the ground aggro deck where Cetus can even just like one shot them, basically just kills them. So if that's the case, like you can recognize that, then you just know that's going to be a really good matchup for you because your deck is just going to consistently have a bunch of shield blasts and it's going to be pretty easy. Where things break down is if that's not the case, right? And that happens against other aggro decks. Like I would say Water Nature is kind of like that, where they're just a pretty consistent deck that can just generate a lot of advantage. And I don't have like a Water Nature deck doesn't have to break shields and like go this like they don't have. It's not like other like a Mono Fire Rush deck that doesn't really have a choice but to just break a bunch of shields, right? Like Water Nature can play a game where it builds up a big board, drops a bunch of Ajax, and like sure Blackfeather exists, but honestly the Blackfeather in this deck is not extremely consistent, which was one of the issues with this deck. Obviously you have a hard time assembling the combo to get it early, and when you do, your mills aren't great, but like they're good enough, obviously. So basically you just watch out for like the Water Nature deck can still like you can manage that, and then that's where you need to identify like if your deck can get exploited in that way where they can just get to a place where your shield blasts aren't really going to be good enough to win the game on their own. Like the Water Nature deck can kind of push through that for the most part. When you identify that that's not the case, then you need to go for a different game plan where you start deploying your like early stuff like your shield wings and your core isles, and you need to play this like kind of aggressive role where you turn your shield blast from like your stabilization tools into reach basically. So you want to play a different game where you just chip in for early damage, force them to kind of like mitigate your board a little bit. Obviously you it's hard to kind of do this because you need to have like sustained pressure, a little bit of like you have to draw like almost multiple of these cards, have them be well sized enough to attack through, and then at the same time but if you can put on if you can break a couple shields, break a few shields, all of a sudden it becomes a lot harder to exploit this deck because now all of a sudden those arbiters that are just like tapping some creatures and not really threatening to win the game, now all of a sudden they are, right? Like you just break a couple shield blast creatures and then like they just drop another creature in a Cetus and all of a sudden you just die, right? So that's one of the things where the Water Nature deck that I was playing was kind of exploitable because you can just like Luminous Shield Wing is bigger than all my early creatures, and then it's able to just break a couple shields on the play, and then you can just pair that, and then all of a sudden your Shield Blast function is Great Reach, like that Storm Spark, that Samo. It just like that alongside like Cryonucleus, it just makes it really easy to just push for extra damage and convert those shields into damage and reach, so that you don't have to. It's harder to be exploited that way. But that's one of the problems is like you have to go for this kind of game plan against a number of other aggro decks. Like there's a bunch of aggro decks you just win for free. There's other ones where you have to go this route, and it makes your deck less consistent because you're not like that's one of the problems. This deck's exploitable by a lot of things. Like you're just no game. Like the problem is like when you go against mid range and control, like you have no game, right? Because you're that shield blast, like Luminous Shield Wing, like Corel, and using Shield Blaster's reach, that has no. It's not going to work against like any like self-respecting mid range or control deck. Like they have the defensive tools to deal with that and not be worried. They can drop an Andromeda and now they don't care about your reach. Like, yeah, basically you have no game in those matchups. Like you have no interaction really that's like meaningful, like no discard. You don't have any card draw. So those are basically unwinnable. So you're just focusing on the aggro matchups. And in those matchups, it kind of sucks that you can be exploited by a bunch of them so that you need this side game plan. And that's like one of the main skills that I think Raginku was really good at, was identifying like how to play those matchups. But I think when you do identify that, I think maybe you want to build a little bit more towards it, like have a little bit more consistency at being able to put on those pressure in those matchups. So I think maybe like trimming down on some of the other stuff, like I don't know, like I wasn't super impressed with Gregorius Fortress. Maybe you still want to like have your Blackfeather hits be good. Maybe you want to play Crystal Memory instead so that you can make your Blackfeather more consistent, because that's a really key part of a lot of matchup plans as well. But yeah, overall, like I felt like it was good enough. Like I think he had against me, he had the draws to do it. Like he had the early Shield Wing Corel stuff in both games. So I think again, 54 cards, and like you don't have a lot of those cards. It's harder to play that game plan, but he had the stuff to do it and ended up winning some tight matches. And had the good Shield Blast to pair with it, obviously. So I don't know. I felt like the Water Nature deck was still a slight favorite. Maybe not a heavy one, obviously, but yeah, he ended up winning that match against me. Against the other aggro decks, I know a few of them were 2-1 wins, so I'm not sure exactly. I never got the chance to see how they played, but I imagine it's kind of similar. like you have to kind of play a little more aggressive. Like Cetus against Darksteiner's deck is very, very strong. So if you're able to land it, it's quite good. It's just you don't consistently see that, and I think that's one of the main things is it's hard to get the balance right because you want to play a ton of shield blasts, but you also need to play a little bit of that cheap stuff, and you also need to have like a little bit of like the more high impact stuff, and then you also want to balance things so you have good hits with Blackfeather. Maybe that's honestly one of the problems with this deck is like trying to balance those things while also making Blackfeather good. Maybe you just dismiss that, but then it's a big part of the way you mitigate those being exploited as well as having Blackfeather so they can't just build up an insane board before they go for your shield. So it's kind of complicated. So it's hard to get the vibe right. It's hard to hard to get the mix proper and yeah. But I mean, Regiku did a good enough job. I mean, he had pretty good matchups. Ended up doing well. He basically played against 5 aggro matchups and won them all, and then lost the one mid-range control one. So I mean, maybe to be expected with this kind of deck, but yeah, I think there's maybe a few things that could be polished up, but at the same time, I'm not really quite sure how to approach it. Like, yeah, I don't know. I wasn't really a fan of Recharge, to be honest. Like, obviously, it makes sense, but honestly, it feels like it could just be cut straight up. Like, maybe you just don't need that kind of card. Maybe you go more Cetus even. Maybe you just, yeah, I don't know exactly, but yeah, it's kind of tough to build, but it's a good kind of shot on this kind of mental experiment, but yeah, it has its issues, but obviously went into the right matchups with the right draws this time around. So congrats to Raijinku for the good finish with, I mean, I think something that a lot of people think about but never really try to put into practice. But yeah, pretty decent overall. So that was the tournament. So Kaijudo opened number 6. Congrats to Raijinku. First open win so far. Really strong record as well, 5-1, pretty impressive. Congrats to Darksteiner as well, brought Taksha Rush. Unfortunately, like lost 2 times to this deck, but I think, yeah, it's a little bit tougher. Like, you can do a decent job if you get a Taksha or down early and unanswered, which, to be honest, there's not a lot of hard answers, which is one of the reasons that, yeah, like only Terra Pits basically is like the only real hard answer against a card like Taksha. So, but yeah, Cetus, if you draw like the early little bit of pressure, then it can be kind of tough. But yeah, it was interesting to see how this was. I guess, one other thing I want to talk about is the Dragon matchup with this too. I found that matchup, like I was kind of wondering how it would play out, but I think the big thing that hurt the Dragon matchup for this deck in my testing was just cutting all that top end, like Kalima. Like basically Blackfeather is a key card in the Dragon matchup because Dragon's kind of clunky mid-range deck. They build up a board really well though, and they're good at mitigating aggressive stuff obviously. And the problem was Blackfeather just not being able to get over 13,000 power enough to deal with Awaken was just huge because like your just hits aren't good enough. Like even if you hit like a good hit with any of like the Serpents or above, that clears like the Birds and Lyra, and I thought like Blackfeather could still be good enough to win the matchup. But the problem is like as the Dragon deck, you can just deep draw to Infernus, get a couple of them out, and then you're set for the rest of the game. You can just like obviously there's things that happen with shields, but again, that's part of why this deck is pretty exploitable with public decklists. And that's another point. Public decklists are huge for this kind of deck because like if your opponent doesn't know what's going on, yeah, they're just going to maybe attack the first shield, right? They're just not going to know, right? And you get a lot of advantage out of that with this kind of deck. As soon as like there's public decklists and the ability to game plan and prep, it hurts your odds quite a lot. I think obviously it didn't end up mattering too much for this tournament. Obviously still like it's just a minor flaw. Like when you have an exploitable kind of one-dimensional deck like this, that public deck lists are going to hurt, obviously. But yeah, obviously didn't end up mattering. But yeah, I think that's another thing is the Dragon matchup. Depending on the Dragon build, like if they like my build was playing 3 Infernus, the Awakened, and yeah, it just locks out the deck. There's only like again the 3 Terra Pits as hard answers. So you just lock out all the early stuff and so many of the shield blasts, and then the rest are just like they buy time basically. Like Summot and Stormspark just buy time, but you just can't really put on that much pressure, aggression. Blackfeather isn't really enough to win the game in those matchups. So I found that this deck could even be exploitable by a deck like Dragons, which I thought would be kind of weak to the Blackfeather, but it just ended up not being enough. So I don't know. But overall, I mean, again, dialing it back, congrats to Raijinku. Congrats to... I just went super deep on this one because it was an interesting deck with a lot of interesting matchups, and I don't know, I like thinking about how the matchups play out and how to exploit things and figure things out from both sides. So yeah, this was like one of the bigger thought experiment type decks of the field. The rest are just more simple like aggro matchups and stuff like that. So yeah, really interesting deck from Raijinku. nice to see it developed a bit, but yeah, we'll see if he takes it anywhere else in the future. But all right, so congrats again to Red Jinku for the tournament win, and we'll see how things play out in the next Open, which I should have the results for, which has already happened. Again, it's been a while, so thanks everyone for sticking around, watching the video, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.